The stars above New Eden had always been beautiful. Lisa Warren stood at the window of her office in the capital city and watched them twinkle in the night sky. She had been governor of this colony for 7 years now, and she loved every moment of it. 3 million people called this world home. They had built farms and factories and schools. Children played in parks and couples walked along the rivers. It was a good life on New Eden, and Lisa was proud of what they had created so far from Earth. The first warning came at midnight. A young officer named Peter Holt ran into her office with panic in his eyes. He told her that long-range sensors had detected ships entering the system. Many ships, more than 50 vessels of unknown design, were heading toward the planet at high speed. Lisa felt her stomach drop, but she kept her face calm. She asked Peter to show her the sensor data, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The ships were massive. They looked like crystals floating through space with sharp edges and glowing cores. Nothing in the colonial database matched their design. These were not human ships, and they were not from any species that humanity had ever encountered. Lisa knew in that moment that everything was about to change. She ordered the colonial militia to activate all defensive systems. New Eden had a small garrison of soldiers and a handful of patrol ships, but they were not built for war. They were meant to handle pirates and smugglers and small threats. Whatever was coming toward them was something far beyond their ability to fight. Commander stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the blue-green world growing larger on his display. He was tall and thin, with skin like polished glass and eyes that glowed with pale light. His species called themselves and they had conquered 17 star systems in the past 6 cycles. They were masters of the galaxy, and no species had ever stood against them for long. This small human colony would fall just like all the others. He knew very little about humans. His intelligence officers had given him reports about a species from a distant world called Earth. The reports said that humans were soft and short-lived and prone to fighting among themselves. They had only recently begun to explore the stars, and their technology was primitive compared to weapons. Expected this conquest to take no more than a few hours. The colonial patrol ships moved to intercept the alien fleet. Captain Greg Palmer commanded the lead vessel, and he knew his people had no chance of winning this fight. But he also knew that every minute he could delay the enemy was another minute for civilians to reach the shelters. He opened a channel to the alien flagship and tried to communicate. He asked them to identify themselves and state their intentions. The response came in broken human language. They had learned enough to deliver a simple message. They said that this world now belonged to the Dominion and that all humans would submit or die. There would be no negotiation and no mercy. Captain Palmer closed the channel and gave the order to engage. The battle lasted 11 minutes. Plasma lances cut through the patrol ships like fire through paper. Greg Palmer watched his friends die around him as explosions tore through his vessel. He managed to send one final message back to the planet before his ship was destroyed. He told Governor Warren that he was sorry and that he hoped help would come in time. Lisa Warren received the message in her bunker beneath the Capitol building. Tears ran down her face, but she did not have time to mourn. She had 3 million people counting on her, and she needed to act. She turned to her communications officer and told him to send the distress signal on all frequencies. She wanted every human ship within range to hear their call for help. The message went out across the void of space. It traveled at speeds faster than light through relay stations and communication buoys. It carried the desperate words of a woman watching her world burn. "This is New Eden calling for help. We are under attack by unknown hostile forces. Please send assistance immediately. Our people are dying. Please help us." Sergeant Brooks led his militia unit through the streets of the Capitol as the first landing craft descended from the sky. He was 42 years old, with gray in his hair and scars on his hands from 20 years of service. He had fought in border conflicts and put down criminal organizations, but he had never seen anything like the creatures that stepped out of those landing craft. The soldiers were tall and fragile-looking with long limbs and smooth faces. They carried weapons that glowed with strange energy, and they moved with an arrogance that made angry. They clearly expected no resistance from the humans cowering before them. They were wrong about that. Gave the order to open fire. Human bullets tore through the first wave of soldiers, and the aliens screamed in shock and pain. They had never faced a species that would fight back so fiercely against impossible odds. Knew his people could not win this battle, but he would make the enemy pay for every inch of ground they took. The fighting spread across the planet as humans refused to surrender. Farmers picked up hunting rifles and joined the militia. Factory workers built barricades in the streets. Teachers led children to safety through underground tunnels. Everyone did what they could to resist the invasion, even as ships bombarded their cities from orbit. Governor Warren watched the destruction from her bunker and prayed that someone had heard their distress signal. She did not know that help was already on the way. She did not know that her desperate message had reached the ears of people who would never abandon their own kind. All she could do was hold on and hope that humanity would answer the call. In orbit above New Eden, Commander grew frustrated. He had expected a quick victory, but these humans were proving difficult to control. They fought like cornered animals, and they showed no fear of death. His soldiers were taking casualties, and his timeline was falling behind schedule. He gave the order to increase the bombardment. If the humans would not surrender, then he would simply burn them out. The night sky above New Eden glowed orange with fire as the attack continued. But somewhere in the darkness of space, 1,000 points of light were beginning to move. They had heard the call and they were coming home. Admiral Jack was sitting in his office at Fleet Command in Houston when the distress signal arrived. He was 63 years old with white hair and deep lines on his face from decades of service. He had commanded ships in 3 different conflicts, and he had buried more friends than he cared to remember. When his aide brought him the message from New Eden, he read it twice before setting it down on his desk. The intelligence reports that followed painted a grim picture. An unknown alien species had attacked a human colony with overwhelming force. The colonial defenses had been destroyed in minutes. Ground forces were fighting a losing battle against superior numbers and technology. Best estimates gave New Eden 72 hours before the entire population was either dead or enslaved. Jack stood up and walked to his window. He looked out at the city of Houston spread before him and thought about the 3 million people on New Eden. They were farmers and teachers and children. They had left Earth seeking a better life among the stars. Now they were dying because some alien species had decided that humans were easy prey. He made his decision in that moment. He returned to his desk and activated the emergency beacon that had not been used in over a century. It was a signal reserved for the most desperate situations, a call that would reach every human vessel in known space regardless of their mission or location. The message was simple and direct. Our people are dying. Come home. The signal spread across the galaxy like ripples in a pond. It reached military vessels on patrol and cargo ships hauling supplies between colonies. It found research stations in distant nebulae and mining operations in asteroid belts. Everywhere humans had traveled, the message followed. And everywhere it went, humans answered. Captain Daniel Price was commanding the carrier Ironclad when he received the call. His ship was patrolling the outer colonies hunting for pirates when the emergency beacon lit up his communications board. He read the message once and then called his senior officers to the bridge. They had 300 fighters in their bays and a crew of 4,000. Within an hour they had set course for New Eden at maximum speed. Lieutenant Commander Amy was on the destroyer Swift Justice running escort duty for a convoy when she heard the call. She was only 31 years old, but she had already earned a reputation as one of the finest tacticians in the fleet. She informed the convoy captain that she was breaking formation and then pushed her engines beyond their rated limits. Her crew did not complain. They understood what was at stake. Captain Cross commanded the battleship Sovereign. He was a big man with a deep voice and a temper that frightened junior officers. When he received the distress signal, he simply smiled and gave the order to set course. His weapons officers began preparing every gun and missile on the ship. They would be ready when they arrived. But it was not just the military ships that answered the call. Across human space, civilian vessels changed course and headed for New Eden. Mining ships loaded with ore dumped their cargo and burned for the colony. Transport vessels carrying passengers asked their customers if they wanted to join the fight. Most of them said yes. Private yacht owners who had never fired a weapon in their lives volunteered their ships as medical transports. Cargo haulers offered to carry supplies and ammunition. Even a group of smugglers operating in the outer systems decided that this was more important than profit. Humanity was gathering for war. On Earth, the news spread quickly. Families watched the reports with fear in their eyes as they learned about the attack on New Eden. Protests erupted in major cities as people demanded that the government do more to help. Recruitment offices were flooded with young men and women wanting to join the fight. The spirit of humanity was awakening in a way that had not been seen for generations. Admiral watched the tracking display in his command center as more and more ships reported their status. Green dots appeared across the map representing vessels that were racing toward New Eden. The numbers grew every hour. 100 ships, 300 ships, 500 ships. By the end of the first day, over 1,000 vessels had answered the call. He contacted each major ship commander personally and gave them their orders. They would gather at a rally point on the edge of the New Eden system and then advance together. There would be no individual attacks and no heroics. They would fight as one fleet united by a common purpose. The aliens had picked a fight with the wrong species. Jack boarded his flagship, the dreadnought Defiance, and took his place on the bridge. The Defiance was one of the largest warships humanity had ever built. It carried enough firepower to devastate a continent and enough armor to survive almost anything. It had been designed in secret during the decades after first contact, when humanity realized that the galaxy was full of potential threats. Now it would finally serve its purpose. The fleet gathered in the darkness between stars. Ships of every size and type arrived at the rally point and took their positions. Carriers and battleships formed the core of the formation. Destroyers and cruisers protected the flanks. Civilian vessels hung back ready to provide support and evacuation. It was the largest gathering of human ships in history. Admiral looked at the display showing his assembled fleet and felt pride swell in his chest. These people had come from every corner of human space to help strangers they had never met. They had left their families and their jobs and risked their lives because someone needed help. That was what it meant to be human. He opened a channel to the entire fleet and spoke to them directly. He told them that they were about to face an enemy of unknown strength and capability. He told them that some of them would not survive the coming battle, but he also told them that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. They were fighting for the people of New Eden and for the future of their species. The fleet began to move. 1,000 ships accelerated toward the colony where their people were dying. They would arrive in less than a day, and when they did, they would learn why Earth was classified as a Category 12. They would learn what it meant to pick a fight with the survivors of 4 billion years of evolution. They were coming, and nothing in the galaxy would stop them. Commander had studied the reports about humans before launching his attack on New Eden. His intelligence officers had gathered data from long-range observations and intercepted communications. They had learned the basics about this strange species from a distant world called Earth. But reading reports was very different from understanding the truth. The reports said that humans came from a world with gravity nearly twice as strong as their atmosphere was thick and filled with a corrosive gas called oxygen that would burn lungs. Their planet experienced extreme temperature variations that would kill any sensible species. Predators roamed every continent and diseases lurked in every water source. By all logical measures, Earth should have been lifeless. Yet humans had not only survived on this hellish world, they had thrived. They had spread across their planet and built civilizations and developed technology. They had reached into space and begun colonizing other worlds. And now they were fighting back against with a ferocity that his soldiers had never encountered before. The ground campaign was not going well. Soldiers were trained to fight against species that surrendered when faced with superior force. They were not prepared for humans who hid in rubble and attacked from shadows. They were not ready for farmers who knew how to shoot and factory workers who built weapons from scrap metal. Every street corner held potential death, and the casualty reports were growing longer every hour. Received word from his ground commander that progress was slow. The human militia was retreating into the mountains and forests where soldiers could not follow. The thin atmosphere and cold temperatures of the highlands were dangerous for his troops. Humans seemed perfectly comfortable in conditions that would kill in hours. He decided to increase the orbital bombardment. If his soldiers could not root out the resistance, he would simply burn everything until nothing remained. He gave the order to target population centers and infrastructure. Within hours, the capital city was in flames and millions of humans were fleeing into the countryside. Governor Lisa Warren watched the destruction from a bunker in the mountains north of the capital. She had evacuated with the last group of civilians before the bombardment intensified. Now, she was coordinating the resistance from a cave system that had been converted into an emergency command center. Her people were dying, but they were not giving up. Sergeant Brooks led what remained of his militia unit through the forests east of the mountains. They had been fighting for 36 hours without rest. Several of his soldiers were wounded and all of them were exhausted, but they kept moving because stopping meant death. They ambushed patrols when they could and faded into the wilderness when the enemy brought reinforcements. Had learned a lot about the aliens in the past day and a half. He had learned that they were fragile compared to humans. Their bones broke easily and their skin tore like paper when hit by shrapnel. They could not handle cold or heat or rain or any of the conditions that humans dealt with every day. They were dangerous because of their weapons and their numbers, but they were not invincible. He passed this information back to Governor Warren through a network of runners and hidden radio stations. The knowledge spread among the resistance fighters and gave them hope. These aliens could be hurt. These aliens could be killed. These aliens could be beaten. On the bridge of his flagship, Commander was growing uneasy. His sensors had detected something strange at the edge of the system. Faint energy signatures were appearing and disappearing as if ships were arriving and then going silent. He ordered his tactical officers to investigate, but they could not get clear readings. The signatures were too far away and too numerous to count accurately. The first confirmation came when a scout ship reported contact with human vessels. The pilot managed to send a brief message before his ship was destroyed. Humans were arriving in force. Many ships, very many ships. The scout estimated at least 100 vessels but admitted that the number might be much higher. Felt something he had never experienced before. It was a cold sensation in his chest that spread through his body and made his hands tremble. He did not recognize the feeling because he had never known fear. His species had never faced a situation where victory was uncertain. They had always been the predators and never the prey. More reports arrived over the next few hours. Human ships were gathering at a rally point on the edge of the system. Their numbers continued to grow as more vessels dropped out of faster-than-light travel and joined the formation. By the time the humans began their advance, was facing a fleet of over 1,000 ships. He contacted his and requested reinforcements. The response was not encouraging. The nearest Dominion fleet was 6 cycles away and could not arrive in time, would have to fight with the ships he had. 53 vessels against more than 1,000. The mathematics were not favorable. His officers suggested retreat. They could withdraw to Dominion space and return with a larger force. They could report what they had learned about human military capabilities and let the High Command develop a proper strategy. There was no shame in withdrawing from an impossible situation. Rejected their advice. The Dominion had never retreated from any enemy. His species had conquered 17 star systems through strength and determination. He would not be the first commander to run from a fight. He would stand and face the humans and prove that the Dominion was still the supreme power in the galaxy. He arranged his fleet in a defensive formation around the planet. His ships would use their superior weapons technology to destroy the human vessels before they could close to effective range. He was confident that plasma lances would tear through human armor like claws through flesh. The enemy might have numbers on their side, but the Dominion had quality. On New Eden, Governor Warren received word that human ships had been detected entering the system. She gathered her people in the cave and told them that help was coming. Tears streamed down the faces of men and women who had been fighting without hope for nearly 2 days. Brooks stood at the back of the crowd and allowed himself to smile for the first time since the attack began. They had arrived. Now the real battle would begin. Admiral Jack stood on the bridge of the Defiance and looked at the tactical display before him. The fleet was arranged in a tight formation around New Eden with their weapons pointed at his approaching armada. 53 enemy ships against his fleet of over 1,000. The numbers were heavily in his favor, but he knew better than to underestimate an unknown enemy. He opened a channel that would broadcast on all frequencies. His voice reached every human ship in the fleet and every vessel in orbit. He spoke slowly and clearly so there would be no misunderstanding. He identified himself and explained that the humans had come to defend their colony. He gave the one chance to withdraw from the system without further combat. If they refused, he promised to show them why humanity had earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous species in the galaxy. He warned them that humans had spent millions of years fighting for survival on a world that tried to kill them every single day. He told them that they had made a terrible mistake attacking New Eden. Commander received the message and felt anger replace his earlier fear. How dare these primitive creatures threaten the Dominion? How dare they speak to him as if they were equals? He would teach them the price of such arrogance. He ordered his fleet to open fire. Plasma lances reached across the void and struck the leading human ships. Explosions blossomed in the darkness as several vessels took damage. But the human fleet did not stop. They kept advancing and began returning fire with their own weapons. The battle began in earnest. Captain Daniel Price launched all 300 fighters from the ironclad and watched them swarm toward the enemy fleet. Each pilot knew that they were facing weapons more advanced than anything humans had built. They did not care. They pushed their craft to speeds that would have killed any pilot and began their attack runs. Lieutenant Cross flew her interceptor through a barrage of plasma fire that would have incinerated any ship in its path. Her heart was pounding at 180 beats per minute. Her muscles burned from the strain of high-speed maneuvers. Sweat soaked her flight suit, and her hands ached from gripping the controls. She fired her missiles at the nearest enemy vessel and watched them impact against its crystalline hull. They had never faced pilots like this. Human reflexes were faster than anything they had encountered. Human endurance allowed them to sustain combat operations long after pilots would have collapsed from exhaustion. Human courage drove them to attack even when logic said they should retreat. Captain Cross brought the Sovereign into weapons range and began firing every gun on his ship. Missiles and shells and energy beams poured from his battleship in a continuous stream of destruction. He targeted the largest enemy vessel and watched his weapons tear through its shields and armor. Commander saw his flagship shudder as human weapons impacted against its hull. Warning alarms sounded throughout the bridge as damage reports flooded in from every section. His crew was dying and his ship was burning. He gave orders to concentrate fire on the attacking battleship, but his gunners could not track the human vessel fast enough. The Sovereign took 3 direct hits from plasma lances. Fire erupted on multiple decks and atmosphere began venting from breaches in the hull. Captain Cross ordered damage control teams to seal the worst ruptures while he continued pressing the attack. His ship was hurt, but she was still in the fight. Lieutenant Commander Amy led her destroyer Swift Justice in a flanking maneuver around the enemy formation. She had identified a gap in their defensive coverage, and she was exploiting it ruthlessly. Her ship was small and fast, and they could not bring their heavy weapons to bear before she was past them. She targeted the engines of an enemy cruiser and fired a spread of torpedoes. The weapons struck true, and the alien ship began spinning out of control as its propulsion systems failed. Was already moving to her next target before the first one finished dying. The battle raged for hours. Human ships took terrible punishment and kept fighting. Vessels crumbled under the relentless assault and began to break formation. Commander watched his fleet die around him and finally understood what his intelligence reports had failed to capture. Humans did not fight like other species. They did not surrender when the situation became hopeless. They did not retreat when casualties mounted. They fought with a ferocity that logic. They fought because giving up was simply not in their nature. Captain Chris Fuller commanded the cruiser Relentless and lived up to his ship's name. His vessel had taken 5 direct hits and was barely holding together. Half his crew was dead, and the other half was fighting fires and sealing breaches. But his weapons were still functional and he refused to withdraw. He ordered his ship to ram the nearest enemy vessel. His helmsman looked at him with wide eyes but obeyed the order. The Relentless accelerated toward a destroyer and struck it head-on at full speed. Both ships exploded in a ball of fire that consumed everything within 1,000 kilometers. Admiral watched the sacrifice on his tactical display and felt grief tighten his chest. Chris Fuller had been a friend for over 20 years. Now he was gone, but his death had taken an enemy ship with him, and that was exactly the kind of trade humans had been making since the dawn of their species. The fleet was collapsing. Their formation had broken apart and their ships were trying to flee in different directions. Human vessels pursued them ruthlessly and destroyed them one by one. Commander ordered his flagship to retreat, but his engines had been damaged and he could not escape. Marines from the carrier Ironclad boarded his vessel and fought their way to the bridge. Sergeant Laura led the assault team through corridors filled with smoke and debris. She was from Montana and she had grown up hunting deer in the mountains. Fighting aliens in the confined spaces of a starship was easier than surviving a winter in her home state. She reached the bridge and found Commander standing alone among the bodies of his crew. He looked at her with those pale, glowing eyes, and she saw something that surprised her. She saw understanding. He finally knew what humans were capable of. She raised her weapon and ended the battle. The silence that followed the battle was almost as shocking as the violence that had preceded it. Admiral Jack stood on the bridge of the Defiance and looked out at the wreckage drifting through space. Shattered hulls and scattered debris marked the graves of ships from both sides. The stars that had once seemed beautiful now looked cold and indifferent. The cost of victory was staggering. 47 human ships had been destroyed during the battle. Another 200 vessels had sustained damage ranging from minor to catastrophic. Over 12,000 men and women had given their lives defending New Eden. They would never see their families again. They would never walk on Earth again. They had paid the ultimate price for the survival of their species. But the Dominion had paid a far heavier toll. Their entire expeditionary fleet had been annihilated. 53 warships reduced to drifting wreckage. Every soldier and crew member killed or captured. Commander was dead on the bridge of his flagship with a human bullet in his chest. Not a single vessel had escaped to carry word of their defeat back to the Dominion. Captain Daniel Price brought the Ironclad alongside the Defiance and requested permission to come aboard. He had lost 47 of his pilots during the battle, but his ship was still operational. He wanted to speak with the Admiral personally and pay his respects to the fallen. Jack welcomed him onto the bridge, and the two men stood together in silence for a long moment. They had known each other for decades and words were not necessary. They understood the weight of command and the burden of sending people to their deaths. They would carry that burden for the rest of their lives. On the surface of New Eden, the survivors emerged from their hiding places and looked up at the sky. The flames that had consumed their cities were dying down. The orbital bombardment had stopped. Word was spreading that the alien fleet had been destroyed and help had arrived. People wept with relief and hugged strangers and fell to their knees in gratitude. Governor Lisa Warren made her way down from the mountains with the remaining members of her staff. The capital city was in ruins, but the spirit of her people was unbroken. They had fought against impossible odds and held on long enough for rescue to arrive. That was something to be proud of. Sergeant Brooks walked through the destroyed streets of his and tried to find something recognizable. He had grown up on these blocks and raised his family here. Now everything was ash and rubble, but he was alive and his people were free. That was enough for now. They would rebuild. Humans always rebuilt. The first rescue ships began landing in open fields outside the city. Medical teams rushed to help the wounded, while supply drops brought food and clean water to the survivors. Soldiers from the fleet set up temporary shelters and organized distribution centers. The massive machinery of human civilization was already moving to heal the wounds of war. Admiral came down to the surface to meet with Governor Warren in person. He found her standing in the ruins of her office building looking at the debris with tired eyes. She was covered in dust, and her clothes were torn, but she stood straight and met his gaze without flinching. He told her that she had shown remarkable courage in leading her people through this crisis. He said that her decision to send the distress signal had saved millions of lives. The entire fleet had answered because of her message. She had given them something to fight for. Lisa shook her head and said that she had simply done what any leader would do. She had asked for help and her people had answered. That was the human way. They never abandoned their own regardless of the cost. Over the following days, the fleet worked to secure the system and begin repairs. Engineers assessed the damage to the colony and began planning reconstruction. Intelligence officers examined the wreckage of ships and collected data about their technology. Scientists studied the bodies of dead aliens and learned about their biology. Every piece of information might be useful in the battles to come. Because everyone knew that this was not the end. The Dominion would learn about the destruction of their fleet. They would send more ships and more soldiers. They would come seeking revenge for their fallen warriors. The war was just beginning. Admiral gathered his senior commanders for a briefing on the situation. He stood before them with a map of known territory displayed behind him. The Dominion controlled 17 star systems and possessed resources far greater than what they had sent to New Eden. This battle had been won, but the war was far from over. He told them that they needed to prepare for what was coming. They needed to build more ships and train more soldiers. They needed to form alliances with other species who had suffered under aggression. They needed to carry the fight to the enemy before the enemy could strike again. But most importantly, he told them that they needed to remember what they had proven at New Eden. They had shown that humans could face any threat and survive. They had demonstrated that their species would never submit to conquest. They had announced to the galaxy that they were a force to be reckoned with. On the last day before the fleet departed, a memorial service was held for the fallen. Every ship in the Armada sent representatives to the surface of New Eden. They gathered in a field outside the ruined capital and listened as the names of the dead were read aloud. 12,000 names, 12,000 heroes. Governor Warren spoke at the end of the ceremony. She thanked the men and women who had come to save her world. She promised that New Eden would never forget the sacrifice that had been made, and she made a vow that her people would stand ready when the time came to return the favor. The fleet departed the next morning. Ships rose from the surface and joined their sisters in orbit. They formed up in their battle groups and set course for human space. They carried the wounded and the weary. They carried the lessons they had learned, and they carried a message for anyone in the galaxy who might be watching. Humanity had arrived among the stars. They had come from a world that spent 4 billion years trying to kill them. They had evolved in an environment that would destroy any other species. They had survived ice ages and plagues and predators and wars. And now they were spreading across the galaxy, bringing that same stubborn refusal to die. They had learned this lesson the hard way. Other species would learn it as well in the years to come. Some worlds should not be challenged. Some species should not be threatened. And humans would never stand alone.